Since the earliest days of humanity, people have looked for guidance, protection, and meaning in their lives. Long before the rise of great empires, long before the construction of palaces and monuments, small groups of humans gathered in clans and tribes. They hunted together, farmed together, and struggled together against the harshness of nature. Yet even in these earliest communities, one truth slowly revealed itself. Without leadership, there was no order. And without order, there could be no survival. The story of kingship begins not with crowns of gold, but with the simple need for unity. Imagine a tribe thousands of years ago, caught between the dangers of wild beasts, famine, and rival groups. Who would make the decisions in moments of crisis? Who would lead the people to water when rivers ran dry? Who would carry the burden of choice when survival itself depended on it? From this need, the earliest kings were born. At first, these leaders were not kings as we think of them today. They were elders, warriors, or shamans, people who earned respect through wisdom, bravery, or a sense of the divine. Their authority was fragile, often contested, but it set the foundation for something greater. Over centuries, leadership transformed into power, and power into kingship. The sacred authority in many ancient cultures, the first kings were seen not only as leaders of men but as chosen by the gods. The divine and the human became intertwined. In Mesopotamia, rulers were believed to act as mediators between heaven and earth. In Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a king, he was considered a living god, the very embodiment of Horus on earth. This sacred power gave kings an aura that no ordinary man could claim. To obey the king was not only a duty to society but an act of worship. His voice was law, his decisions unchallenged. For to defy the king was to defy the divine. And yet, this divine image also carried immense responsibility. A failed harvest, a lost battle, or a flood was not seen as chance. It was a sign that the king had failed in his duty to maintain balance between the gods and the people. Thus, kingship was both a privilege and a dangerous burden. The first cities, as agriculture spread and people settled near fertile rivers, small villages grew into towns, and towns into cities. The rise of cities created the need for stronger, more permanent authority. Leadership could no longer be temporary or tribal. The city itself demanded a figure who could organize trade, defend walls, collect resources, and unite diverse groups under one banner. Here, the true age of kingship began. From Uruk in Mesopotamia to the Nile Valley in Egypt, kings became the beating heart of civilization. They ordered the construction of irrigation canals, temples, and granaries. They turned scattered groups of farmers into organized societies. And with every brick laid and every law carved into stone, kingship moved closer to the image we recognize today, a throne at the center of human life. Symbols of power. The earliest kings understood the importance of symbols. A staff, a crown, or a throne was not just decoration. It was a reminder of authority. These objects carried meaning deeper than words. When a king wore a crown of gold, it reflected not only wealth but the belief that he carried the light of the gods. When he sat on a throne elevated above his people, it reminded all who looked that he stood closer to the heavens. Symbols turned leadership into ritual, and ritual turned power into permanence. Even today, we see echoes of those first royal symbols in modern traditions of leadership. The burden of the throne but kingship was never easy. To rule was to bear the fears, dreams, and struggles of an entire people. Early kings often lived in constant tension, admired by some, feared by others, and always watched closely by priests, nobles, and warriors. A mistake could lead to revolt. A weakness could invite invasion. Many kings learned to balance this burden by surrounding themselves with councils of advisors. Others relied on the sword alone, enforcing their will through sheer force. Some succeeded, building dynasties that lasted centuries. Others vanished, remembered only in fragments of broken stone. Yet even in their failures, they shaped the world. Every king, whether mighty or forgotten, added a chapter to humanity's long story of leadership. Closing of Block 1. Thus begins our journey into the world of ancient kings. From humble tribal leaders to godlike rulers of vast empires, their rise was not sudden but gradual, born from humanity's need for unity and strengthened by the belief in divine power. As we move forward, we will see how these kings transformed not only their people, but the very face of the earth. Their empires, their wars, their laws, and their dreams still echo in the ruins of palaces, the stones of temples, and the legends that survive today. This is the dawn of kings. the beginning of power that would shape civilizations for thousands of years. The rise of kings was not just about power, weapons, or wealth. It was about belief. People in the ancient world often lived close to fear of floods, droughts, storms, or disease. To survive in such uncertainty, they turned to the divine. And in that faith, kings found their greatest source of power. Kings as divine beings in Egypt. The pharaoh was not only a king but a god on earth. His very breath was said to carry the will of the heavens. When the Nile flooded, it was believed to be a sign of the pharaoh's harmony with the gods. When it failed, whispers of divine anger spread quickly. In Mesopotamia, kings were not gods themselves, but they ruled with the authority of the gods. They built great ziggurats that reached toward the sky, stairways between heaven and earth, reminders that the king was the bridge between mortal and divine. And in other cultures from India to Mesoamerica, rulers were often seen as chosen ones, blessed by sacred signs, their authority written in the stars. Rituals of power. Every king knew that rituals were not optional, they were essential. Without them, his power was fragile. Ceremonies of coronation, where crowns of gold or diadems of jewels were placed upon a ruler's head, were not just celebrations, they were sacred acts. The moment a crown touched the brow, a man became something more, a living embodiment of divine will. Sacrifices, feasts, and festivals were held to honor the gods, but also to remind the people that their king walked closely with them. To see the king in sacred robes, to watch him pour wine upon an altar, to hear priests chant his name alongside that of the gods, these were moments that bound society together. Law. As sacred command, kings also learned that the power of law could not stand alone. It needed to be sanctified. Hammurabi of Babylon carved his famous code into stone, not as his personal command, but as a gift from the sun god Shamash. This was not just clever politics, it was a masterstroke of psychology. If a law came from a man, it could be questioned, but if it came from the gods, to question it was heresy. Thus, obedience was not only civic duty, but spiritual obligation. The priest and the king, but kings were not alone in their divine role. Priests often stood beside them, guardians of rituals, interpreters of omens, and keepers of sacred knowledge. In some lands, priests challenged kings, while in others, they became their closest allies. This balance of power between crown and temple shaped much of ancient politics. A wise king knew he needed both the sword of the warrior and the blessing of the priest. Without both, his throne was unstable. The cost of divinity, yet to be seen as divine, was not only a gift, it was a burden. If crops failed, if disease spread, if enemies triumphed, the people looked to their king with suspicion. Had he lost the god's favor? Was he still worthy of the throne? Some kings were overthrown when disasters struck. Others were sacrificed, offered to the very gods they once claimed to embody. In being divine, kings gained unchallenged authority, but they also carried the unbearable weight of expectation. Closing of block to thus. In the early centuries of kingship, power and divinity became inseparable. To rule was to be chosen. To command was to speak with the voice of the gods. And to fail was not simply to falter as a man. It was to betray the sacred order of the universe. As we journey deeper, we will see how this belief in divine kingship shaped cities, inspired monuments, and carved legacies into stone, legacies that still whisper to us through temples and ruins today. Kingship was never just about crowns and rituals. True power demanded a stage, a place where authority could be seen, heard, and felt. That stage was the city. In the rise of ancient kings, no achievement spoke louder than the creation of great cities, palaces, and temples. These were not just homes for people, they were monuments to the king himself, carved into the earth for all time. From villages to capitals before kings, human settlements were little more than clusters of huts, near rivers and fertile soil. People gathered for survival, not grandeur. But once kings emerged, these small villages transformed. They became centers of administration, worship, and defense. Under the guidance of rulers, walls were built to protect against enemies. Granaries were raised to store food for harsh seasons. Markets flourished as trade brought wealth and color from distant lands. And at the center of it all stood the king's palace, towering above every home. A reminder of who held power. The palace was not simply a residence. It was the symbol of the kingdom. To enter it was to step into a space where human will met divine authority. Every stone, every carving, every statue whispered of the king's strength. Temples and sacred spaces, if palaces, displayed the king's earthly power. Temples displayed his heavenly connection. Kings invested vast resources into temples, ensuring that gods appeared honored and satisfied. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose toward the sky, their steps inviting the gaze of the heavens. In Egypt, temples stretched across the desert sands, filled with towering columns and sacred halls where only priests could enter. In India, kings sponsored the carving of elaborate shrines from solid rock, eternal offerings to the divine. These monuments were not just for worship, they were political tools. To build a temple was to say, "The gods favor me, and through me, they favor you." Roads, canals, and infrastructure. But kings were not only builders of stone, they were architects of society itself. A wise ruler knew that power depended not only on armies but on roads, bridges, and canals. In Mesopotamia, canals diverted river waters into farmlands, ensuring survival in dry seasons. In Rome, roads stretched across continents, binding the empire together. In Persia, the royal road allowed messages to travel faster than ever before, giving kings control over vast lands. These projects were not glamorous, but they made kings eternal in the eyes of their people. A good harvest, safe travel, a thriving market. These everyday blessings reminded citizens that their ruler was not only powerful but essential. Architecture as propaganda. Kings also understood that stone could speak louder than words. A temple, a fortress, or a palace was not just functional, it was propaganda in stone. When Hammurabi built his palaces, when Ramses carved his likeness into towering statues, when Ashoka raised stone pillars across India, each monument was a declaration. I was here. I am mighty. I am eternal. Even today, when we walk among the ruins of these empires, we feel their presence. Though the kings themselves are long gone, their stones still stand, whispering of ambition, glory, and power. The people behind the stones yet, every brick and pillar was laid by human hands. Workers, artisans, slaves, and farmers carried the weight of the king's vision. Thousands labored in the sun, carving, lifting, and shaping the monuments of empire. For the people, these projects were heavy burdens. Taxes were demanded, labor was forced, and suffering was often the hidden cost of greatness. Yet, in their sweat and struggle, the dreams of kings took shape. The irony of empire is this. Though kings built monuments for their own glory, it was the hands of the common people that made them possible. Closing of Block 3, thus, cities rose, walls grew, temples reached heavenward, and palaces shone with wealth. Kings carved their legacies into stone, ensuring that even when their names faded from memory, their works would remain. The city itself became the king's greatest weapon, a living monument, a center of power, and a beacon of civilization. That as we continue, we will see how kings turned these cities not only into homes of worship and rule, but into fortresses of war, launching pads for conquest, and symbols of eternal power. If cities and temples were the symbols of a king's authority, armies were the iron that defended it. No crown could shine without the sword, and no throne could endure without soldiers standing ready at its feet. From the deserts of Egypt to the valleys of Mesopotamia, from the mountains of Persia to the plains of India, kings learned that power depended as much on military might as it did on divine favor. The king as warrior. In the earliest days of kingship, rulers were not distant figures hidden behind palace walls. They were warriors who fought alongside their people. A king's strength was measured not only in wealth or wisdom, but in how bravely he rode into battle. Stories of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia, Ramses in Egypt, and Alexander in Greece all carried the same truth. A king who could not fight, could not rule. The battlefield was both a stage and a proving ground. Victory brought glory, defeat brought shame, and sometimes death. Even centuries later, when kings commanded from thrones rather than front lines, the image of the warrior king remained vital. Statues showed them armed with spears and swords. Carvings displayed them crushing enemies under their chariots. And songs praised their courage as if they were chosen champions of the gods themselves. Building the army, but no king could fight alone. To hold power, they needed armies, not just bands of warriors, but organized, disciplined forces. In Mesopotamia, kings trained soldiers to march in formation, shield to shield, spear to spear. In Egypt, chariots gave pharaohs speed and power. turning battlefields into open theaters of dominance. In China, kings and emperors developed vast armies armed with crossbows, weapons that could pierce armor from a distance. To raise these forces, kings imposed taxes, demanded labor, and sometimes forced conscription. A man might farm one season and fight the next. His life divided between the plow and the sword. The army became both the king's shield and his hammer, defending the kingdom and striking at enemies beyond its borders. War as expansion. For many kings, war was not only defense but opportunity. To conquer was to claim wealth, land, and glory. Victories expanded kingdoms into empires, and empires into legends. The Assyrian kings carved terror into the hearts of their enemies, using brutal tactics to enforce obedience. Alexander the Great carried his armies across continents, leaving behind cities named in his honor. Ashoka of India fought a war so bloody that he turned to peace and the teachings of Buddhism, proof that even kings could be transformed by the horrors of battle. Each conquest left behind not only scars but stories. To the people of the time, war was both devastation and destiny, shaping the boundaries of nations and the legacies of rulers. Weapons of power. Armies evolved alongside technology. Spears and shields gave way to bronze swords, and bronze gave way to iron. Chariots ruled the battlefield until cavalry took their place. Bows became crossbows, and crossbows became catapults and siege machines. Every new weapon changed the balance of power. Kings who mastered innovation rose. Those who resisted fell. To rule meant not only to pray and build, but also to adapt, to ensure that one's army was always stronger, faster, and better armed than the enemy. The price of war. But war was costly. Behind every victory lay empty fields, grieving families, and broken lives. Farmers were taken from their land, wealth was drained for weapons, and kingdoms stretched thin from constant fighting. Some kings became prisoners of their own ambition, chasing conquest after conquest until their empires collapsed under the weight of exhaustion. Others, wiser, learned to balance war with diplomacy, turning enemies into allies and soldiers into peacekeepers. Closing of block. For thus, kings built their thrones not only with stone and prayer but with the blood and steel of their armies. The sword defended their crowns, and the chariot carried their names into eternity. But war was a double-edged blade. It brought glory and expansion, but it also carried the seeds of ruin. As we continue, we will step away from battlefields and look at the world beyond the sword, the ordinary lives of people who served these kings, the farmers, workers, and families whose daily struggles gave rise to the empires of history. Behind every mighty king and every towering monument stood countless ordinary lives. The throne may have carried the crown, but the kingdom rested on the shoulders of its people. From the farmers who tilled the land to the artisans who carved stone, from the soldiers who marched to war to the children who grew up beneath palace walls, the story of kings was always the story of their people, farmers and the fields. For most of history, the majority of people were farmers. Their lives followed the rhythm of the seasons, planting, tending, and harvesting crops that fed the kingdom. Kings depended on their labor, for without food, no city could survive, and no army could march. Taxes were often collected in grain, livestock, or produce. Farmers worked not only for their families but for their rulers, filling royal storehouses with the fruit of their toil. In times of plenty, these harvests fed festivals and feasts. In times of famine, they became a matter of life or death, though their names were rarely carved into stone. Farmers were the silent lifeblood of empires. Without their steady hands, the grandest visions of kings would have withered in the dust. Artisans and builders. The beauty of a kingdom was shaped by its artisans. Stonecutters carved monuments, sculptors shaped statues of kings, and metalworkers forged weapons and jewelry. Painters decorated palaces with vibrant murals, while potters crafted vessels for both temples and homes. These skilled workers transformed raw materials into symbols of power. Every towering temple, every gleaming crown, every shining weapon bore the fingerprints of artisans whose identities history has mostly forgotten. Kings celebrated their architects and builders, yet rarely their names. But in truth, it was these hands that gave kings their image of eternity. Soldiers and guardians for many men. Life was spent in the service of the army, recruited from villages and towns. Soldiers defended walls, guarded caravans, and followed kings into distant battles. Life as a soldier was harsh. Long marches, scarce food, the constant threat of death. Yet, it also carried honor. Soldiers could rise in rank, earn land, or win rewards from grateful rulers. They were celebrated in songs, painted on walls, and carved into reliefs, immortalized as defenders of their king's glory. But behind the image of bravery was hardship. Many soldiers left families behind, never to return. Their sacrifices were the unseen cost of empire. Women of the kingdom, though often absent from royal records, women played vital roles in the life of kingdoms. They worked in fields, managed households, wove textiles, and raised children. In markets, they sold goods and sustained local economies. Some women rose to positions of influence: queens, priestesses, or healers who shaped decisions from behind the scenes. Others lived quietly, their contributions woven into the daily rhythm of survival. Together, they carried half the weight of society. Though history rarely gave them half the credit, festivals and daily joys. Life was not only labor and war. Festivals filled the calendar, marking harvests, victories, and sacred rituals. Streets filled with music, dance, and feasting. People gathered to watch ceremonies, to hear priests chant, and to glimpse their king in sacred processions. In these moments, ordinary people felt part of something greater, connected not only to each other, but to the divine. The joy of festivals reminded them that even under the weight of kingship and taxes, life carried moments of light and celebration, the silent backbone of empires. The greatness of kings often overshadows the lives of those they ruled. Yet without the daily efforts of farmers, artisans, soldiers, women, and children, no empire could stand. Kings may have commanded, but it was the people who sustained. Their labor-filled granaries, their hands raised monuments, their blood defended borders, and their songs carried traditions forward. Though history remembers kings, it was the common people who gave kingdoms their beating heart. Closing of Block 5. Thus, in the story of kings, we must never forget the story of the people. Their lives, though simple and unrecorded, were the foundation upon which thrones were built. As we move forward, we will see how kings sought not only to govern their people, but to enrich their realms through trade, wealth, and the flow of goods across continents. If armies won empires and cities held them together, it was trade that made them flourish. For kings, wealth was more than luxury. It was the very lifeblood of power. To build temples, feed armies, and fund monuments, kings needed gold, grain, and goods. And so they turned their gaze to the roads, rivers, and seas that carried wealth across the world. The first markets in the early days, trade began with simple exchanges: grain for pottery, cloth for tools, salt for livestock. Yet, as villages grew into cities, these humble exchanges became bustling markets, filled with color, sound, and the promise of profit. Kings quickly saw the power of markets. They taxed traders, guarded caravans, and sometimes even joined expeditions. A thriving market was not just a source of wealth, it was a symbol of stability. Where trade thrived, people trusted their king. Roads and caravans to control trade. Kings built roads that stretched across their realms. These roads were not just paths of stone and dust, they were the veins through which wealth flowed. In Mesopotamia, donkeys and oxen carried loads of grain and wool across the plains. In Egypt, the Nile served as a living highway, carrying boats filled with papyrus, wheat, and gold from Nubia. In Persia, the royal road allowed merchants to cross the empire in weeks rather than months, spreading goods and ideas faster than ever before. Caravans became symbols of wealth. Long lines of camels and donkeys crossed deserts carrying spices, ivory, and silk. With every arrival, cities filled with exotic goods, and kings filled their treasuries. Ports and sea trade did not stop at land. Seas and rivers became highways of wealth. The Phoenicians sailed across the Mediterranean, carrying purple dye, timber, and glass. Egyptian ships brought incense from the lands of Punt, spices from Arabia, and gold from Africa. For kings, control of the sea was as valuable as control of land. Ports became jewels of empire hubs, where ships arrived heavy with treasures and departed carrying the name of the king to faraway lands. The king's treasury with wealth came the power to build. Gold and silver filled the treasuries of kings, funding temples, palaces, and armies. Gemstones adorned crowns and thrones, while fine fabrics clothed royalty in colors that only the rich could afford. But kings also knew that wealth was fragile. A famine, a war, or a broken trade route could empty treasuries in an instant. Wise kings stored grain in vast silos and collected tribute from conquered lands. Building reserves for hard times. To rule was to balance spending and saving, to enjoy wealth without wasting it, to share enough to keep people loyal while keeping enough to remain secure. The Silk Roads and beyond. As centuries passed, trade routes stretched farther than ever before. From China to Rome, the Silk Roads carried goods, ideas, and even religions across continents. Silk, spices, ivory, and gems moved westward, while glassware, olive oil, and wine moved east. Along with them came stories, languages, and cultures. Kings who controlled these routes became not just rulers of people but guardians of civilization itself. Wealth and power. Trade was more than prosperity, it was power. A king who controlled trade routes could command alliances, demand tribute, and dominate neighbors. Wealth allowed him to hire mercenaries, fund spies, and influence distant rulers, but wealth also tempted greed. Many wars were fought not for glory, but for control of markets and roads. Behind the clash of swords often lay the simple question: who would control the rivers of gold? Closing of Block 6. Thus, trade became the hidden empire within every empire, a network of roads, rivers, and seas that fed kings with wealth and nations with life. When we look at ruins of palaces or the remains of ancient ships, we see more than stone and wood. We see the proof that kings understood one eternal truth: to rule the people, one must first master the flow of wealth. As we continue, we will turn from wealth and markets to another foundation of kingship, the power of law and order, and how rulers shaped justice to hold their realms together. If armies defended kingdoms and temples honored the gods, it was trade that filled the veins of empire with life. For ancient kings, wealth was not just luxury, it was power. Without it, no palace could rise, no soldier could be fed, and no legacy could endure. The birth of markets. Trade began simply. Farmers exchanged grain for tools, shepherds traded wool for salt, and artisans swapped pottery for food. But as villages grew into towns, these small exchanges blossomed into markets. Stalls filled with colors and smells, spices, cloth, and metals became the beating heart of city life. Kings quickly understood the power of markets. A thriving bazaar meant prosperity. And so, rulers taxed merchants, protected trade routes, and sometimes even sent their own expeditions in search of riches. Roads, caravans, and control lay kings. Control over roads meant control over wealth. Mesopotamian rulers built tracks across plains. Egyptians turned the Nile into a living highway, its boats heavy with papyrus, wheat, and gold. Persians stretched the royal road across their empire, speeding the flow of goods and messages alike. Caravans wound their way through deserts, camels loaded with ivory, silk, and precious stones. Wherever they stopped, markets thrived, and kings grew richer. Masters of the seas. Beyond the roads lay the open waters. Phoenician sailors braved the Mediterranean with ships full of purple dye, glass, and timber. Egyptian fleets sailed south for incense and east for spices. Ports glittered with treasures from faraway lands, each arrival swelling the king's coffers. A wise king knew that to rule the land was not enough. The sea too had to be mastered. Wealth and the royal treasury, gold, silver, and gemstones filled royal treasuries. Kings draped themselves in silks and clothed their thrones in jewels. But wealth was more than display, it was survival. Stored grain and collected tribute could save a kingdom in times of famine or war. A careful ruler spent wisely, balancing generosity with caution. Too much greed bred rebellion, too much spending brought ruin. The art of kingship lay not only in gaining wealth, but in holding it. The great highways of trade. Over centuries, trade stretched farther than ever before. The Silk Roads connected east and west, carrying silk, spices, and gems across deserts and mountains. Alongside goods, traveled stories, religions, and ideas. Kings who controlled these routes controlled civilization itself. To guard a road was to command not just wealth, but influence, to bend distant lands to their will without ever raising a sword. The hidden power of trade. Behind every war, behind every alliance, wealth often whispered its true purpose. Many kings went to battle not for glory but for control of rivers, roads, and markets. The struggle for trade shaped the borders of kingdoms as surely as armies ever did. Closing of Block 6. Trade was the hidden empire within the empire. It fed the people, enriched the crown, and carried the name of kings to the ends of the earth. The ruins of markets, the fragments of ships, and the echoes of caravans remind us that kings understood one timeless truth: to rule the people, one must first command the flow of wealth. If armies defended the land and trade enriched it, then law was the glue that held kingdoms together. Without order, cities fell into chaos. Without justice, kings lost the loyalty of their people. And so, rulers across history became not only warriors and builders, but judges, the final voice of right and wrong in their realms. The birth of law in the earliest days, justice was personal. Families avenged wrongs, tribes punished offenders, and vengeance often spilled into endless cycles of bloodshed. But as societies grew larger, this could no longer work. A single fight could tear apart a whole community. It was kings who first transformed justice from private vengeance into public law. Their word became the rule, their judgment the final answer. What once belonged to families now belonged to the throne. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the most famous examples, comes from Babylon, where King Hammurabi carved his laws into stone nearly 4,000 years ago. These laws were displayed in public for all to see. They covered everything: trade, marriage, theft, property, even injury. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, the code declared. To us, it may sound harsh, but at the time it brought order. People knew the rules, and they knew the punishment. Justice was no longer guesswork, it was written in stone. But Hammurabi did more than create rules. He claimed the gods themselves had given him these laws by tying justice to the divine. He made disobedience not only a crime against the king, but a sin against heaven. Kings as the supreme court in many ancient lands. The king was the final court of appeal. Local judges could decide disputes, but the hardest cases rose to the throne. Imagine a farmer and a merchant locked in conflict over a harvest, or two families feuding over land. They could plead their case before the king, who sat upon his throne, not only as ruler, but as the living embodiment of justice. To see the king judge fairly was to believe in the stability of the world itself. A corrupt king, however, invited rebellion, for people would not follow a ruler who could not uphold fairness. Law, as power laws, were not just about fairness. They were also tools of control. Kings used laws to set taxes, demand labor, and protect their authority. By controlling the rules of life, they controlled life itself. Yet wise kings knew law was a double-edged sword. Too much harshness bred hatred, too much leniency bred disorder. The greatest rulers walked a careful line, balancing fear with fairness, justice and religion. In many cultures, law and religion were inseparable. Egyptian pharaohs ruled through Mahat, the principle of cosmic balance and order. To disobey the pharaoh was to disrupt the universe itself. In Israel, kings ruled under divine commandments, their authority tested by whether they upheld the sacred covenant. In India, the laws of Dharma blended moral duty with royal justice, binding ruler and ruled together under one cosmic order. This blending of justice and faith made kings more than lawmakers. It made them guardians of the sacred dot. The legacy of ancient law in today. The echoes of ancient kings ring in our laws, from Hammurabi's code to Roman legal systems. Their influence shaped how societies understood fairness, punishment, and duty. The belief that rulers should protect order, ensure justice, and uphold law is a legacy that outlived the kings themselves. Closing of Block 7. Thus, the king stood not only as warrior, builder, and priest, but as judge. His voice was law, his decisions carved into the lives of his people. To rule meant not only to conquer but to ensure order. As we continue, we will see another tool kings used to strengthen their power. Not war, not law, but alliances. Through marriages, treaties, and diplomacy, they extended their reach beyond their borders, weaving networks of power that sometimes proved stronger than any sword. A sword could win a battle, and a law could maintain order. But kings soon learned that true power required something more subtle. The art of alliance. Where war destroyed, diplomacy built. Where conquest took, marriage joined. Through treaties, promises, and bloodlines, rulers created bonds that sometimes proved stronger than walls or weapons. Than the need for allies. No king ruled alone. Even the mightiest kingdoms needed neighbors, for trade, for peace, or for protection against greater threats. A wise king understood that an ally today might prevent a war tomorrow, or ensure victory in a battle yet to come. Alliances allowed kings to extend their reach without drawing a sword. A treaty could open new trade routes, grant access to vital resources, or secure a border without bloodshed. Where war drained wealth, alliances preserved it. Bought marriage as politics. Royal marriages were never just about love. They were about strategy. A daughter given in marriage could unite two kingdoms. A son married into a foreign family could secure a throne abroad. Through weddings, Kings bound nations together in ties of kinship that armies might hesitate to break. The practice was common across the ancient world. Egyptian pharaohs married princesses from neighboring lands to ensure peace. European kings married across dynasties to bind rival houses together. In India, alliances through marriage shaped entire kingdoms, blending cultures and traditions. Each wedding was not merely a family event, but a political act, a chess move on the board of empires. Diplomats and envoys where kings could not go. Envoys carried their voices. Diplomats traveled across deserts, seas, and mountains, bearing messages sealed in wax, gifts of gold, or promises of peace. These men were more than messengers. They were spies, negotiators, and representatives of their king's honor. Their words could prevent wars or spark them, depending on how carefully they were chosen. In ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets record treaties sealed between kings. In Rome, envoys negotiated alliances that shaped the Mediterranean. In China, emissaries traveled along the Silk Roads to distant kingdoms, weaving a network of influence that stretched far beyond borders. Treaties and oaths alliances were sealed not only by words but by sacred rituals. Kings swore oaths before gods, sacrificed animals to mark treaties, or carved promises into stone. Breaking such an oath was not only dishonorable but dangerous, for to break a treaty sworn by the gods was to invite their wrath. These treaties often set boundaries, demanded tribute, or ensured mutual defense. Though fragile, they created stability in a world where war was never far away. Betrayals and broken promises, yet alliances were fragile things. Kings were ambitious, and promises were often broken when opportunity arose. A marriage could be undone by betrayal, a treaty cast aside when greed outweighed loyalty. History is filled with stories of treachery, kings who turned on allies, families who betrayed their bonds, wars sparked by broken trust. Diplomacy, like war, was always a gamble. The legacy of diplomacy despite its risks. Diplomacy shaped the ancient world as deeply as war did. Through marriages, treaties, and envoys, kings connected cultures, spread ideas, and built relationships that outlasted generations. The ruins of palaces still hold traces of gifts exchanged between rulers. Ancient tablets, scrolls, and inscriptions remind us of promises once made in the hope of peace. Though kings are gone, the art of diplomacy endures, for the world is still bound not only by power, but by the fragile threads of agreement. Closing of Block 8. The power of kings was not forged only in iron or carved in stone. It was woven in bonds of blood, sealed in treaties, and carried in words across borders. The crown was not only a symbol of force, but of trust. As we move forward, we leave the halls of politics and treaties behind, and enter a different realm of kingship, the realm of myth and story. For some rulers became more than kings. They became legends, their names echoing through time long after their kingdoms had vanished. Not every king left behind stone walls or written laws. Some left behind something far more powerful: stories. These kings lived in such a way, or were remembered in such grandeur, that history blurred into legend. Over time, they became more than men. They became myths. Gilgamesh, the first hero king in Mesopotamia. The name of Gilgamesh still echoes from clay tablets written nearly 4,000 years ago. Part king, part god, part myth, Gilgamesh ruled the city of Uruk. His story is told in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's first great tale. He fought monsters, sought immortality, and questioned the meaning of life itself. Though the real Gilgamesh may have been a mortal ruler, his legend grew larger than life. To the people of Uruk, he was not only a king, he was a hero whose struggles mirrored their own. King Solomon, wisdom eternal in the ancient world of Israel. King Solomon became a symbol of wisdom. His reign was remembered not only for wealth and power, but for the justice of his decisions. Stories tell of how he judged disputes with unmatched insights, how his kingdom thrived under peace, and how his temple stood as a beacon of faith. Even centuries later, his name became synonymous with wisdom. His image woven into scripture, legend, and song. King Arthur, the once and future King far to the west. In medieval Britain, a king named Arthur became the heart of legend. Whether he truly lived or not remains a mystery, but his story lives eternal. A king who pulled a sword from stone, who led knights at a round table, and who sought the Holy Grail. Arthur's story was not just about battles or conquests. It was about ideals, courage, honor, loyalty, and the dream of a just kingdom. In this way, he became more than a king. He became a timeless symbol of hope. Pharaohs and eternal life in Egypt. The pharaohs built monuments so vast they seemed to touch the sky. Their pyramids, temples, and tombs were not only homes for the dead but symbols of divine eternity. Kings like Ramses II carved their names into stone so deeply that thousands of years later, they are still read. To the people of Egypt, these kings were not simply rulers of the Nile, they were gods, their presence echoing in every statue, every temple wall, every desert horizon. The making of legends. What made these kings into legends was not only what they did, but how they were remembered. Storytellers turned victories into epics, wisdom into parables, and battles into songs. Over time, history melted into myth, and myth gave birth to symbols that lived far beyond the lives of kings themselves. Legends inspired armies to fight, nations to unite, and generations to dream. A king's power might fade, but his story could last forever. Closing of Block 9. Thus, kings lived not only in palaces and temples but in stories. They became larger than life, eternal, in the words of poets, scribes, and singers. Some were real, others imagined, but all served the same purpose, to remind people of courage, wisdom, and hope. As we continue, we leave the world of myth and return to the harsher reality of kingship. For while some rulers became legends, many others faced downfall. In the next chapter, we will explore the fall of kings and the collapse of empires. Every crown shines brightly at its beginning. Every throne seems eternal when it is first built. Yet history teaches us that no king, no matter how powerful, could escape the shadow of decline. Some fell to enemies, others to betrayal, still others to their own weakness. The fall of kings is as much a part of history as their rise. Greed and ambition. Many kings fell because their hunger for power was greater than their wisdom. They waged endless wars, drained their treasuries, and demanded too much from their people. At first, victories brought glory, but over time, exhaustion set in. Fields lay empty as farmers became soldiers. Markets slowed as taxes rose too high. The same ambition that once built empires often destroyed them, for when kings forgot that their people were the foundation of their rule, their kingdoms began to crumble. Betrayal and weak heirs. Some thrones were lost not to enemies outside, but to betrayal within. Advisors plotted, generals turned, even families schemed. A king might rise with strength, but if his heirs were weak, the dynasty faltered. History is full of kings undone by their own bloodline. Sons too young, brothers too ambitious, daughters married into rival houses. The bonds of family that once held kingdoms together often became the very forces that tore them apart. Invasions and foreign conquerors. No matter how strong, no kingdom could stand forever against waves of foreign invasion. The great cities of Mesopotamia fell one after another to Persians, Greeks, and later Romans. Egypt's pharaohs eventually bowed before foreign rulers. Even mighty Rome itself, once ruler of the known world, was overrun by tribes it had once called barbarians. For every empire that rose, there was always another power waiting beyond its borders, watching, preparing to strike. The wrath of the people. Perhaps the most dangerous enemy a king could face was not a rival ruler, but his own people. Oppression, hunger, or injustice could ignite rebellion. When kings forgot the balance between rule and responsibility, their subjects often rose in anger. From peasant uprisings in medieval Europe to revolts in the heart of Asia, history shows that even the mightiest crown could be toppled if the people beneath it chose to rise. The silence of ruins. What remains after the fall of kings? Palaces crumble, walls collapse, and thrones vanish into dust. But ruins still whisper their stories. Walk through the fallen stones of Babylon, the broken statues of Egypt, or the silent streets of once mighty cities, and you feel the echoes of power and of loss. The ruins remind us of one eternal truth. Kings may command armies and build wonders, but time spares no throne. Lessons of Decline. The fall of kings teaches us not only about endings but about humanity itself. Power is fragile. Glory is temporary. Wisdom, fairness, and balance matter as much as strength. Those who forgot this were remembered not for their victories but for their failures. Closing of Block 10. So ends this chapter of downfall. Where once kings were gods on earth, they became mortals again, vulnerable, fallible, and often forgotten. But even in their collapse, they left behind lessons, ruins, and stories that shaped the world to come. For after every fall, a new king rises. a new throne is built, and the cycle begins again. As we continue, we turn from the fall of kings to their legacies, the monuments, laws, and ideas that survived long after their crowns turned to dust. Kings rise and kings fall. Their crowns are buried, their palaces crumble, and their armies fade into memory. Yet, even when their bodies return to dust, something of them endures. For true kingship was never only about the present. It was about leaving behind a mark on the world, a legacy to echo through time. Monuments of strength. The most visible legacy of kings is carved in stone. Pyramids of Egypt still pierce the sky, long after the names of many rulers have been forgotten. The ziggurats of Mesopotamia stand as stairways to heaven, reminders of the ancient kings who claimed to bridge gods and men. Temples, palaces, statues, all of them spoke a message louder than words. I was here. I ruled. I will not be forgotten. Though many have crumbled, their ruins remain, calling out across millennia. Even in decay, they remind us of the ambition of kings. Laws that shaped societies. Not all legacies were carved in stone. Some were written in words, codes, and systems that shaped entire civilizations. Hammurabi's laws, Roman legal traditions, and the principles of Dharma in India still influence justice today, long after their thrones were empty. The laws of kings guided generations. In this way, their voices continued to speak, even centuries beyond their deaths. Faith and belief. Kings also left behind spiritual legacies. Pharaohs tied themselves to gods, shaping Egyptian religion for thousands of years. Kings of Israel left traditions that still echo in the Abrahamic faith. Indian rulers like Ashoka carried Buddhism beyond borders, transforming a kingdom's belief into a world religion. Through temples, rituals, and sacred stories, the divine image of kings endured far longer than their reigns. Cities and roads. Kings built cities not just for their lifetimes, but for generations. Roads they paved still lie beneath modern highways. Aqueducts still carry water in lands once ruled by Caesars. Markets they founded grew into towns, and towns into nations. Every city has layers of history, and at its foundation often lies the hand of a king. Legends that never die. Perhaps the greatest legacy of kings is not stone, law, or city, but story. Legends of Gilgamesh, Solomon, Arthur, and countless others continue to inspire. Their names became more than rulers. They became symbols of wisdom, courage, sacrifice, and ambition. Stories survive where monuments fade, and it is through these tales that kings remain alive in human memory. The dual legacy. Yet, not all legacies are glorious. Some kings are remembered for tyranny, cruelty, and ruin. Their names live on as warnings rather than inspirations. In this way, history judges kings twice, once in life and once in memory. For a crown may be inherited, but legacy is earned. Closing of Block 11. Thus, kings left behind more than treasures. They left behind pathways for humanity itself, laws, cities, stories, and ideas that still shape our lives today. Their thrones may have crumbled, but their legacies endure in every stone, every scroll, and every legend whispered across time. As we continue, we now turn to the rituals of kingship, the coronations, ceremonies, and sacred acts that transformed ordinary men into rulers touched by the divine. A crown was not enough to make a king. Power needed ceremony. Authority required ritual. Across the ancient world, rulers became kings not simply by seizing thrones, but by being crowned through sacred rites that bound them to gods, people, and destiny. The coronation. The coronation was the heart of kingship. It was not merely a political event, but a sacred transformation. A man entered as himself. He emerged as something greater, the embodiment of his people's hopes, and the chosen of the divine God. In Egypt, pharaohs were crowned with a double crown, symbolizing rule over both Upper and Lower Egypt. In Mesopotamia, kings received scepters and staffs from priests, signs that their rule was blessed by heaven. In medieval Europe, kings were anointed with holy oil, a practice that echoed the rituals of ancient Israel. Every coronation told the people, this man is no longer ordinary. He is chosen. He is king. Symbols of authority. The ritual tools of kingship were more than ornaments. They were powerful symbols. The crown represented divine light. The throne, the seat of justice. The scepter, the power to command. In some lands, the act of sitting on a throne itself was a ritual. In others, the king was lifted above the people, a physical symbol of his rise above ordinary life. These objects and acts were reminders that kingship was not only political but cosmic. sacred. Oaths. Kings were often required to swear oaths during coronation. They promised to protect their people, uphold justice, and honor the gods. Breaking such oaths was more than betrayal, it was sacrilege. In Babylon, rulers swore to maintain divine order. In medieval Europe, Christian kings swore upon Holy Scripture. In India, kings vowed to protect Dharma, the universal law of righteousness. These promises bound them, at least in principle, to more than power. They tied kings to the moral and spiritual expectations of their people. Festivals and public ceremonies. Rituals did not end at coronation. Throughout their reign, kings performed festivals, sacrifices, and public displays. In Rome, emperors hosted games and spectacles to honor gods and entertain citizens. In Mesopotamia, New Year festivals reaffirmed the king's right to rule. In Egypt, pharaohs appeared in processions, their presence a living ritual that reminded the people of divine kingship. Such ceremonies were more than pageantry. They reassured people that the universe was in balance, that their ruler stood firm between chaos and order. Kings as priests. Many kings took on priestly roles. They offered sacrifices, spoke prayers, and led rituals themselves. By stepping into the temple, they blurred the line between mortal and divine. To the people, their king was not just a ruler of men but a mediator with the gods. This dual role gave kings immense power, but also immense responsibility. A failed ritual, a poorly timed omen, or a disaster after a ceremony could cause doubt. Ritual was power, but it was also risk. Closing of Block 12. Thus, kingship was not only a matter of swords and crowns, it was woven with sacred acts and divine promises. Rituals transformed men into monarchs, bound their authority to heaven, and gave their rule a sense of permanence that armies alone could not. As we move forward, we leave the sacred halls of coronations and processions and step once more into the practical realities of empire to see how kings organized their realms, built systems of governance, and created the machinery of state that allowed their power to endure. A crown on the head and a scepter in the hand were symbols, but symbols alone could not feed armies, build cities, or keep peace. Behind the glitter of ceremony lay the hard reality of governance, the machinery of rule that kept kingdoms alive. Councils and advisors. No king could rule alone. Even the strongest needed counselors, priests, generals, scribes, and elders. Some were loyal, others ambitious. Together they formed the circle of power around the throne. In Egypt, the vizier served as the pharaoh's right hand, overseeing taxation, courts, and administration. In Mesopotamia, scribes recorded decisions in clay, turning words into law. In medieval courts, nobles and bishops debated policies, sometimes guiding the king, sometimes resisting him. Advisors could make or break a reign. Wise kings listened. Arrogant ones ignored. Taxation and wealth. To rule was to gather resources. Armies needed food, temples needed gold, cities needed roads. Taxes became the lifeblood of kingdoms. Farmers paid in grain, merchants in coins, conquered peoples in tribute. But taxation was a delicate balance. Demand too little, and the kingdom starved. Demand too much, and rebellion flared. Kings who understood this balance thrived. Those who did not faced ruin. Law and justice. Justice was one of the king's greatest responsibilities. To his people, he was not just a ruler but the ultimate judge. In Babylon, Hammurabi's code was carved in stone for all to see, declaring the rights of rich and poor alike. In Rome, emperors presided over courts, ensuring the empire's laws reached every corner. In medieval Europe, kings sat in judgment, their word final in disputes. Law gave order, justice gave legitimacy. Without them, no throne could last long. Administration and bureaucracy. As kingdoms grew, so did their complexity. A single ruler could not watch every border or manage every harvest. Bureaucracies rose, networks of officials who carried the king's authority across towns, provinces, and villages. Messengers galloped across roads with royal decrees. Governors collected taxes and kept peace. Military commanders held frontier posts. Scribes filled archives with endless records. This invisible machinery made empires possible. A king was its heart, but the veins and arteries stretched across his land. Military organization. The sword was never far from the crown. Armies were the backbone of power, and kings maintained them with care. Soldiers were trained, equipped, and fed. Generals led with loyalty or ambition. Fortresses rose at borders, and armies marched in campaigns that extended the king's reach. Yet armies were not only for conquest, they maintained peace within, crushed rebellion, and reminded subjects of the strength behind the throne. Communication and control required communication. Ancient kings built roads, messengers, and signal systems to reach distant lands. In Persia, the royal road carried messages faster than ever before. In China, imperial couriers carried the will of the emperor across vast distances. Communication bound together what distance threatened to break apart. Without it, empires dissolved. Closing of Block 13. Thus, kingship was not only about glory, but about management. Thrones rested not only on divine blessing or heroic tales, but on councils, laws, taxes, and armies. The machinery of rule was the true skeleton of empire, unseen yet essential. Where it worked, kingdoms thrived. Where it faltered, crowns fell. As we continue, we turn to a more subtle realm of kingship, not swords or taxes, but the art of image and propaganda. For kings understood that power was not only about what they did, but about how people believed in them. A king's power did not rest only on armies, laws, or wealth. It also depended on belief, the belief of his people that he was chosen, just, and mighty. To nurture this belief, rulers crafted images of themselves that transcended reality. They built monuments, spread stories, and used symbols to turn their reigns into something larger than life. Kings as divine figures in Egypt. Pharaohs were not just rulers, they were gods on earth, children of Ra, Horus reborn. Statues showed them towering above subjects, their faces calm and eternal, untouched by human weakness. In Mesopotamia, kings claimed divine blessing, their names inscribed with symbols of gods. In medieval Europe, kings ruled by divine right, crowned with the blessing of the church. By linking themselves to heaven, rulers strengthened their hold on earth. Monuments as messages. Every palace, every temple, every statue was propaganda in stone. The Great Pyramids were not just tombs, they were eternal billboards declaring Pharaoh's godlike power. The statues of Ramses II at Abu Simbel faced outward, warning enemies and inspiring subjects. In Rome, triumphal arches proclaimed victories. In China, the Great Wall itself was both defense and symbol, a visible line of imperial power stretching across mountains. These structures whispered the same message: the king is eternal, the king is mighty, the king will not be forgotten. Stories and chronicles. Words too were weapons. Scribes wrote chronicles that glorified rulers. Poets sang praises of their bravery, and myths intertwined kings with heroes. Even defeats could be reshaped into tales of honor. For many subjects who never saw their ruler, these stories were their only window. A tale told well could magnify a king far beyond his true reach. Ritual and display. Kings understood the theater of power. Processions, festivals, and rituals were not just religious acts, they were performances. The people saw their ruler clad in gold, seated on a throne, or parading with armies. Such spectacles reminded the crowd of his greatness. Even those who never spoke to their king would carry the memory of his majesty home to their villages. Symbols of authority. Crowns, thrones, and robes were carefully chosen symbols. In Europe, crowns glittered with jewels said to hold divine blessings. In Asia, dragon robes symbolized imperial connection to cosmic order. In Africa, sacred drums, staffs, and masks represented royal presence even when the king himself was absent. Symbols carried messages silently but powerfully. They told people who ruled and why. Controlling the narrative. Kings also knew the danger of stories told by others. Many sought to control the narrative by silencing dissent, burning rival chronicles, or erasing names from monuments. Pharaohs like Hatshepsut had their images defaced after death. Emperors rewrote history to cast themselves as heroes. Propaganda was not only about what was shown, it was about what was hidden. Closing of Block 14. The image of a king was carefully crafted, part truth, part illusion. Monuments, rituals, and stories combined to create a presence that felt larger than life. People might never meet their ruler, but they believed in him, and that belief was as powerful as any army. As we continue, we will move beyond symbols into the cultural heart of kingship, exploring how rulers shaped art, music, and literature, leaving behind legacies not just of power but of beauty. Power could be measured in armies and wealth, but the greatest kings understood that true immortality came through culture. By supporting artists, musicians, and writers, rulers carved their names into the soul of civilization. Their reigns became golden ages, remembered not only for conquest but for beauty. The king, as patron from ancient Mesopotamia to Renaissance Europe, rulers acted as patrons, protectors, and sponsors of creativity. Artists, poets, and musicians depended on royal courts, where their works glorified the throne while enriching society. This was a silent bargain. The king gave support, and in return, his image lived forever in paint, stone, and song. Art as power art served as propaganda, but also as inspiration. Egyptian tombs glowed with colors, telling stories of pharaohs' journeys into eternity. Assyrian palaces displayed carvings of kings slaying lions, a symbol of their strength. In Europe, portraits captured monarchs as majestic and untouchable. In Asia, delicate scroll paintings reflected emperors' taste and refinement. Every brushstroke whispered, "The king is greatness itself." Music of the court music was more than entertainment. It was ritual, ceremony, and symbol. In Africa, drums echoed royal commands. In China, orchestras performed in court rituals, each note tied to cosmic harmony. In medieval Europe, minstrels and choirs filled castles with song, glorifying rulers in verse. Music bound people together, lifting their spirits in times of triumph and mourning. Through melody, kings touched hearts beyond the reach of law or sword. Literature and learning kings who valued wisdom left legacies in words. Libraries rose in their courts, filled with scrolls and manuscripts. In Mesopotamia, scribes recorded epics under royal patronage. In India, kings supported scholars whose works shaped philosophy. In the Islamic world, caliphs funded translations that preserved ancient Greek knowledge. In Europe, Renaissance rulers fostered poets, playwrights, and scientists whose works reshaped the world. The pen, under royal protection, became as mighty as the sword. Golden ages of culture. Some reigns are remembered less for battles than for brilliance. The age of Pericles in Athens brought forth drama and philosophy. The rule of Emperor Augustus saw Rome's poets create works that still live today. The Mughal emperors of India left behind paintings, gardens, and architecture of breathtaking beauty. These golden ages prove that culture is the true measure of a civilization's greatness. The immortality of beauty. Armies vanish, palaces crumble, but art endures. A song can echo through centuries. A poem can speak to hearts long after the poet and the king are gone. A painting can preserve the face of a monarch who would otherwise be forgotten. Through culture, kings reached immortality, not in power, but in beauty. Closing of Block 15. Thus, kings were not only warriors or law, they were patrons of the arts, builders of culture, and guardians of beauty. Their crowns may have fallen, but their songs and stories still live. As we continue, we turn from beauty to conflict, for kingship was not always about harmony. In the next chapter, we explore the world of wars and rivalries, where crowns clashed and empires battled for dominance. If culture was the soft light of kingship, war was its shadow. For as long as crowns existed, they clashed. Kings sought not only to rule their own lands but to take those of others, to outshine rivals, and to prove themselves greater than history had yet seen. The story of kings is not only one of peace and patronage, it is also a story of conflict, of crowns that collided, empires that fought, and rivalries that shaped the fate of nations. The desire for Maurya kingdom was never enough for ambitious kings. Borders were lines meant to be broken. Neighbors were opportunities to conquer. Resources, trade routes, and glory drove rulers to wage wars that reshaped the map. In Mesopotamia, city-states fought endlessly, each king trying to outdo the other. In medieval Europe, dynasties clashed for thrones, sometimes dragging entire continents into conflict. In Asia, emperors expanded step by step, swallowing smaller realms until their banners stretched from horizon to horizon. Personal rivalries. Many wars were not about land alone but about pride. Kings saw rivals as mirrors of themselves, reflections they could not tolerate. To defeat another king was not just victory, it was proof of superiority. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage became legendary, with Hannibal and the Roman generals battling not only for territory but for prestige. In Europe, rival dynasties like the Plantagenets and Valois fought for centuries over thrones. In India, the clash of emperors shaped entire ages. The theater of battle. War was not only fought, it was staged. Kings often rode at the head of their armies, their presence a symbol of divine favor. Banners flew, drums thundered, and soldiers marched in rhythm, all designed to impress both friend and foe. Victory on the battlefield was more than survival. It was performance. It was the crown declaring itself mighty before gods and men. Diplomacy through war. Ironically, wars often ended where diplomacy began. After rivers of blood, kings signed treaties, arranged marriages, or exchanged hostages to secure peace. Conflict and alliance danced together, each giving rise to the other in endless cycles. Thus, kings were warriors and negotiators both, wielding sword and pen with equal force. The cost of rivalry, but rivalry carried a price. Fields lay in ruin, people starved, treasuries emptied. Many kings who sought glory left only ashes, for while victory raised crowns high, defeat toppled them into dust. History remembers both the conquerors who forged empires and the fallen who gambled their kingdoms and lost. Closing of Block 16. Thus, crowns were not peaceful ornaments but weapons, each clashing against another in an endless struggle for dominance. Some rivalries gave birth to great empires, others ended in ruin. As we continue, we will step away from battlefields and into palaces, exploring another hidden side of kingship, the role of queens, royal families, and the power behind the throne. Kings wore the crown, but they did not rule alone. Behind the throne stood queens, mothers, sons, and daughters, a web of family whose influence often shaped the course of kingdoms as much as the kings themselves. In public, the king was the face of power. In private, the royal family could be its heart. Their alliances, rivalries, and intrigues determined who rose, who fell, and who truly held control. Queens, as partners in power. In many civilizations, queens were far more than wives. They were advisors, diplomats, and symbols of fertility and stability. In Egypt, queens like Nefertiti and Cleopatra stood as rulers in their own right, their presence essential to royal authority. In medieval Europe, queens often managed courts, arranged marriages, and acted as regents when kings went to war. In Asia, empresses influenced policy, sometimes ruling openly when kings were too young or too weak. The queen's crown was often smaller, but its weight was no less heavy. Mothers of kings. The role of the queen mother could be even more powerful than that of the queen herself. As guardians of young heirs, they wielded authority over courts until the child grew. Some embraced this role with wisdom, others used it for ambition. History remembers figures like Empress Dowager Cixi of China, who ruled behind the scenes for decades, her influence stretching further than many emperors. The phrase, Mother of Kings, was not merely honor, it was power incarnate. Royal marriages and dynasties. Every royal marriage was a political act, weaving bonds between families and empires. Queens carried not only beauty but bloodlines, their unions stitching nations together or igniting wars. A single marriage could unite rival houses, but a broken promise could unleash generations of conflict. The dynastic webs of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East all reveal how royal families turned marriage into a battlefield of its own. Intrigues of the court. Royal families were rarely peaceful. Brothers turned on brothers, daughters plotted with rival nobles, and queens sometimes schemed against their own husbands. Behind the glittering halls of palaces lay whispers of betrayal, plots of poison, and alliances formed in shadow. The throne was never safe from those closest to it. Indeed, the greatest threat to a king often came not from foreign invaders, but from his own kin. Women as hidden rulers, though kings were the official rulers. History is filled with examples of queens who guided kingdoms from behind the curtain. Some shaped policy quietly, others stepped into the light of power themselves. Cleopatra negotiated with Rome's most powerful men. Eleanor of Aquitaine influenced the politics of both France and England. Queens in Africa and Asia often commanded armies or defended their lands with the same determination as their male counterparts. Power wore many forms, and queens mastered them all. Closing of Block 17. Thus, kingship was never solitary. Every throne was surrounded by family, loyal or treacherous, supportive or ambitious. Queens, mothers, sons, and daughters all shaped the destiny of kingdoms in ways both seen and unseen. As we continue, we move from the palace's private chambers to the open world again, to see how kings connected not only with family, but with their people, whose loyalty was the foundation of every crown. A king might wear gold, command armies, and sit upon a throne of stone. But his true power rested not in treasures or soldiers, it rested in his people. For no ruler could reign without their loyalty, their labor, and their belief. The bond between ruler and subject was both fragile and sacred. When nurtured, it brought stability and prosperity. When broken, it unleashed unrest, rebellion, and sometimes revolution. The duty of protection at its core, kingship was an unspoken pact. The people gave loyalty, and in return, the king gave protection. Farmers expected safety from raiders. Merchants demanded secure roads. Priests required support for temples. A good king was a shield, guarding his people not only with armies, but with justice, fairness, and care. In times of famine, wise rulers opened granaries. In times of disaster, they rebuilt cities. These acts, more than war or wealth, earned the lasting devotion of subjects. Symbols of unity. Kings often became living symbols of their people's identity. Pharaohs embodied the land of Egypt itself. In China, emperors ruled as sons of heaven, guardians of harmony between earth and sky. In Europe, kings were crowned by the church, their authority seen as part of God's order. When subjects saw their king, they saw themselves, their culture, their pride, their hopes. Loyalty was built not only on fear or taxes, but on shared identity. The burden of taxes, yet the bond was delicate. Too much burden, and loyalty turned to anger. Heavy taxes drained farmers. Constant wars bled villages dry. A king who forgot the limits of his people risked rebellion. History is full of peasants rising with pitchforks, cities revolting against corruption, and nobles joining commoners to overthrow a crown that had grown to heavy. Festivals and appearances wise, kings did not hide in palaces. They appeared before their people in festivals, rituals, and public ceremonies. These moments reminded subjects that their ruler was not distant but present, a figure they could see, cheer, and honor. From Roman triumphs to Indian processions, from African drum festivals to Chinese parades, these displays were more than spectacle. They were bonds of trust woven in the fabric of daily life. Rebellion and revolution. When kings broke faith with their people, rebellion followed. In England, kings who defied nobles faced charters that limited their power. In France, centuries of burden led to revolution that ended with the guillotine. In China, dynasties rose and fell under the belief in the mandate of heaven. If rulers failed their duty, heaven itself withdrew its blessing, and people rose to replace them. The people were patient, but not powerless. Closing of Block 18. Thus, the relationship between king and people was both strength and weakness. It was the lifeblood of every throne, yet also its greatest danger. For crowns were not held by gold alone, but by loyalty. As we continue, we now turn to the global nature of kingship. How rulers, though separated by oceans and mountains, often mirrored one another, sharing patterns of power across civilizations. Though thousands of miles apart, though speaking different tongues and worshipping different gods, kings across the world often ruled in strikingly similar ways. From the pharaohs of Egypt to the emperors of China, from African chiefs to European monarchs, the essence of kingship carried echoes that transcended borders. Why? Because the challenges of power were universal: to protect, to govern, to inspire, and to endure. Africa, kings of spirit and Drummond, the kingdoms of Africa. Kingship was not only political, but spiritual. Rulers were seen as guardians of ancestral spirits, their authority tied to sacred traditions. Drums, symbols of communication and power, carried their commands across villages. The king was a living link between the living and the dead, between the people and the divine. His presence was celebrated in festivals of music and dance, binding community through culture as much as through law. Asia, emperors of heaven. In China, the emperor ruled as the son of heaven, his authority tied to the mandate of heaven. If he ruled justly, harmony flourished. If he failed, heaven withdrew its blessing, and rebellion followed. In India, kingship was tied to dharma, the sacred duty of maintaining cosmic order. A king who upheld justice was revered. One who failed invited chaos. Across Asia, rulers balanced earthly power with cosmic responsibility. The Middle East, kings as shepherds. In Mesopotamia, the oldest of civilizations, kings were called shepherds of the people. They were responsible for guiding, protecting, and providing, much as a shepherd does for his flock. Law codes, temples, and great cities reflected this image. Later, in the Islamic caliphates, rulers claimed both spiritual and political authority, leading not only with armies but with scripture, faith, and law. Europe, thrones and crowns. European monarchs ruled with a mixture of sacred ritual and feudal power. The crown symbolized divine right, while castles represented earthly strength. Kings balanced the demands of nobles, priests, and peasants, often walking a narrow path between unity and rebellion. Dynasties passed thrones through bloodlines, weaving webs of alliances and conflicts that shaped centuries of history. The Americas, rulers of the sun and stars across the Atlantic. The Mayan kings ruled as mediators with gods of sun and rain, their authority tied to sacred calendars and rituals. The Inca emperors of the Andes claimed descent from the sun itself, building vast networks of roads and temples that stretched across mountains. Here, as elsewhere, the ruler was never merely a man. He was the bridge between people and the divine order of the cosmos. Parallels of power, though separated by oceans. The patterns are clear. Kings everywhere claimed divine connection, built monuments to their power, created laws to maintain order, and relied on rituals to legitimize their rule. They fought wars, arranged marriages, faced rebellions, and sought to leave behind legacies. The details differed, but the heart of kingship beat the same. Closing of Block 19. Thus, kings across the world mirrored one another, like reflections in distant mirrors. Their crowns were shaped differently, their thrones built of different stone, but their struggles and symbols were alike. As we continue, we turn from the global stage to the most personal aspect of kingship, not monuments or empires, but the daily lives of kings. For behind the majesty, they too were men, with habits, fears, and routines that reveal the human side of power. When we think of kings, we imagine them in golden crowns, seated upon thrones, commanding armies and shaping empires. But kings, for all their grandeur, were also men. They ate, prayed, slept, and worried, just as their subjects did. Behind the curtain of majesty lay routines, habits, and fears that revealed the human face of royalty. The morning rituals. The day of a king often began with ceremony. In Egypt, pharaohs were awakened with hymns sung by priests, their first breath greeted as a divine moment. In medieval Europe, kings rose in chambers, attended by servants, who dressed them in layers of robes and armor. Even the act of waking was a performance, for a king's body was not his own, it was a symbol of the realm. Every robe, every jewel, every crown placed upon him reminded the people of his majesty. Meals fit for power. Food was a stage for kingship. Banquets displayed wealth and abundance, while private meals reminded rulers of the pleasures of daily life. In ancient courts, kings dined on exotic delicacies, spices from India, wines from distant lands, fruits from conquered territories. In medieval castles, feasts lasted hours, filled with roasted meat, music, and pageantry. Yet, even at these tables, politics lingered. Who sat closest? Who was invited? Who was denied? Every meal carried meaning. But kings also ate in solitude, sometimes with simplicity, finding quiet moments in the midst of endless duties. Advisors and duties. After meals came work. Kings met with councils, generals, and envoys. They heard disputes, signed decrees, and weighed matters of war and peace. In some courts, these duties stretched for hours. In others, much was delegated to advisors. Yet every decision, whether signed in a royal hand or whispered in a royal ear, carried the weight of nations. Even small choices could ripple outward, shaping lives far beyond palace walls. Family and personal moments. Though public in life, kings also had private roles as husbands, fathers, and sons. They played with children, spoke with queens, and sought comfort in family bonds. Yet, even here, politics intruded. Marriages were alliances, heirs were legacies, and family rivalries often carried deadly consequences. Still, there were moments when kings laughed with their children, listened to music, or found solace in gardens. These glimpses remind us that behind crowns were men who longed, like all people, for peace, leisure, and pastimes. Kings found recreation in hunting, games, and art. Hunting was more than sport. It was a symbol of control over nature, proof of strength. Chess and dice filled halls with strategy and chance, reflecting the very risks of kingship itself. Some rulers painted, wrote poetry, or studied philosophy. Others sought pleasure in music and performance. These pursuits revealed their inner worlds, their tastes, and their vulnerabilities. Nightfall in the palace evenings brought feasts, audiences, or quiet reflection. Guards patrolled halls, courtiers whispered in shadows, and the weight of the day's decisions lingered. Some kings found rest easily, secure in their power. Others lay awake, haunted by doubts, enemies, or omens. For though kings slept on cushions of silk, their crowns often turned into burdens heavy enough to follow them into dreams. Closing of Block 20. Thus, the daily life of a king was both ordinary and extraordinary. Meals, work, family, and rest were laced with ritual, politics, and symbolism. They were men who lived as symbols, every action magnified, every moment observed. As we continue, we step back from palaces to examine the economy of kingship, how rulers managed wealth, trade, and resources to sustain their thrones. Behind every throne stood not only armies and advisors but also wealth, gold, grain, livestock, and trade routes. These were the lifeblood of kingdoms. A king without resources could not build, defend, or rule. Power was not only a matter of crowns and ceremonies, but of economics, the hidden foundation that kept kingdoms alive. The treasure chambers. Palaces often held great treasuries filled with coins, jewels, and precious metals. These chambers were more than storage. They were symbols of power. When envoys visited, kings displayed gold and silver to impress and intimidate. Egypt's pharaohs filled tombs with treasures for eternity. In Persia, vaults overflowed with tribute from conquered lands. In medieval Europe, castles hid coffers of coin guarded by stone walls and steel swords. Wealth was not only security, it was spectacle. Agriculture, the root of power. At the heart of every economy was the land. Farmers produced grain, herders raised animals, and fishermen brought food from rivers and seas. Without them, no king could feed his people or his armies. In Egypt, the Nile's floods brought abundance, turning pharaohs into gods of plenty. In Mesopotamia, irrigation systems built under kings fed entire cities. In medieval Europe, serfs tilled fields for lords and monarchs, their labor forming the foundation of castles and courts. The crown rested, quite literally, on the soil. Taxes and tribute. Kings demanded more than loyalty. They demanded payment. Taxes filled treasuries and funded governments. Sometimes they were fair, sometimes crushing. Grain, livestock, coin, or labor all became currency of kingship. In empires, conquered peoples sent tribute, gold from Africa, silk from China, spices from India. Each gift was both payment and symbol of submission. The more tribute a king received, the greater his prestige. Yet heavy taxes often led to rebellion, too much burden, and the foundation of wealth cracked. Trade and commerce-wise kings understood that wealth grew not only from conquest but from trade. Roads, ports, and markets connected kingdoms, turning cities into hubs of commerce. The Silk Roads carried Chinese silk to Rome, while Roman glass traveled east. Indian spices flavored European feasts, while African gold funded Mediterranean empires. Kings controlled these routes, earning taxes and influence from every caravan and ship. Trade created prosperity, but also envy. Many wars were fought not over thrones but over trade routes, coinage and currency. The invention of coins changed kingship forever. No longer dependent on barter, rulers minted their own images into gold and silver. Every coin became propaganda, spreading a king's face across the land. To spend money was to see the ruler. To trade was to remember his power. Economics and symbolism fused in every coin that passed from hand to hand. Spending wealth. Kings spent wealth not only on armies and palaces, but also on culture and faith. Temples, cathedrals, libraries, and theaters rose from royal patronage. At times, rulers also spent recklessly. Lavish banquets, endless wars, and extravagant luxuries drained treasuries, leading to collapse. A wise king balanced display with prudence. A foolish one gambled his crown for gold. Closing of Block 21. Thus, wealth was the silent crown beneath the visible one. Agriculture fed, taxes sustained, trade enriched, and coinage unified. Without economics, kingship was nothing more than ceremony. As we continue, we now move to the spiritual role of kings, exploring how rulers acted not only as lords of men, but as guardians of faith and mediators with the divine. A king's duty did not end with armies, wealth, or law. In many civilizations, kingship was sacred. Rulers were not only political leaders but mediators between their people and the divine. They offered sacrifices, built temples, and carried the burden of cosmic balance. For subjects, the king was more than flesh and blood. He was chosen, blessed, or even born of the gods themselves. His crown was not just gold, it was a halo of sacred authority. Kings as living gods in Egypt. Pharaohs were worshipped as gods on earth. They were Horus in life, Osiris in death, their rule a mirror of the eternal cycle. Statues showed them towering, eternal, and perfect, never aging, never flawed. Their commands carried divine weight, and their monuments, from temples to pyramids, were offerings to gods and proof of their own godhood. To defy Pharaoh was to defy the heavens. The mandate of heaven in China, kingship was bound to the mandate of heaven. The emperor was the son of heaven, chosen to maintain harmony between earth and sky. If he ruled justly, crops flourished and peace reigned. If he failed, famine, floods, or rebellion were signs that heaven had withdrawn its blessing. Here, kingship was both sacred and conditional, a divine right that could be revoked. Kings as protectors of faith in medieval Europe. Kings ruled by divine right. Crowns were placed on their heads by priests, linking them to the authority of God. Monarchs defended churches, funded cathedrals, and claimed to be guardians of faith. In India, kings supported temples, rituals, and festivals, presenting themselves as protectors of Dharma, the moral and cosmic law. Similarly, in the Islamic world, caliphs and sultans combined political rule with spiritual leadership, enforcing divine law across their lands. Ritual duties. Kingship was filled with rituals. Rulers prayed publicly, sacrificed animals, and led processions. Each act was symbolic, reaffirming their connection to the divine. Festivals often revolved around the king's presence. His appearance was a blessing, his participation proof of divine favor. In Africa, sacred rituals linked kings to ancestors, their every gesture tied to spiritual continuity. Burden of the sacred crown. To be seen as divine or chosen carried immense power, but also immense burden. A failed harvest, a natural disaster, or defeat in war could shake faith in the king's sacred role. Where subjects once worshipped, they could turn to rebellion if they believed the gods had abandoned their ruler. Thus, the spiritual crown was both a blessing and a curse. Closing of Block 2. Thus, kings were not only rulers of people but guardians of faith. They carried the weight of divine authority, walking a line between heaven and earth. Their crowns were not merely metal but symbols of sacred order, binding kingdoms to the mysteries of the cosmos. As we continue, we will explore how kings shaped knowledge and learning, acting as patrons of wisdom and guardians of history. Armies secured borders, wealth filled treasuries, and monuments proclaimed glory. Yet the wisest kings knew that power was incomplete without knowledge. Foreknowledge guided rule, preserved memory, and carried their legacies into future generations. Some rulers saw themselves not only as conquerors, but as guardians of wisdom, protectors of learning, and patrons of scholars. Their courts became centers of knowledge, where scribes, priests, and philosophers gathered to preserve and expand human understanding. The first libraries in Mesopotamia. Kings built the world's first libraries. Ashurbanipal of Assyria collected thousands of clay tablets in his palace at Nineveh, preserving myths, laws, and sciences. His vision was clear: kingdoms might fall, but knowledge could endure. Centuries later, the Library of Alexandria, built under Greek-Egyptian kings, became a beacon of learning, drawing scholars from across the known world. Though much of it was lost, its spirit still symbolizes the dream of kings who valued wisdom as much as power. Scribes and kings relied on scribes to record decrees, collect histories, and maintain archives. These men turned royal words into permanence, ensuring decisions and victories would be remembered. In China, emperors sponsored scholars who compiled histories and standardized knowledge, binding the empire not only with walls and armies, but with shared thought. In India, rulers supported mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers whose ideas shaped civilizations far beyond their borders. Every scroll, every tablet, every manuscript carried the echo of kingship. Religion and philosophy. Knowledge was not only practical but spiritual. Kings funded temples where sacred texts were copied, preserving traditions of faith. Some engaged directly in philosophy, debating questions of justice, fate, and the cosmos. Emperor Marcus Aurelius of Rome left behind meditations that revealed a king's inner struggles. Ashoka of India carved edicts into stone, spreading not conquest but teachings of compassion and peace. Their words remind us that kings could also be thinkers. Patronage of science in the Islamic Golden Age, caliphs sponsored translations of Greek, Persian, and Indian works, filling libraries with knowledge of medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. In Renaissance Europe, monarchs funded scientists and explorers whose discoveries reshaped the world. These kings proved that crowns could guide humanity not only into war but into enlightenment. Knowledge, as power for kings, knowledge was not simply curiosity, it was control. To keep records was to govern more effectively. To write laws was to bind subjects. To understand stars and seasons was to master agriculture and navigation. A wise king guarded knowledge, for he knew that ignorance bred weakness. Closing of Block 2-3. Thus, kingship was not only a matter of might and ritual but of wisdom. Libraries, schools, scribes, and scholars ensured that rulers left more than ruins behind. They left ideas, preserved in words, that outlasted their crowns. As we continue, we turn from wisdom to exploration, to the age of discovery and expansion, when kings sent ships, caravans, and armies beyond horizons, seeking new lands and treasures. For most of history, kings ruled the lands they could see, fields, rivers, and cities within their borders. But as ambition grew, so too did horizons. Rulers hungered for distant treasures, unknown lands, and the power of discovery. Exploration became another face of kingship, one that reshaped the world. The spirit of expansion. Kings sought more than survival. They wanted greatness. To expand borders meant more wealth, more subjects, more glory. Beyond every mountain, across every sea, they imagined kingdoms waiting to be claimed. In ancient Mesopotamia, city-states pushed outward, seeking fertile lands. In Rome, emperors stretched their empire from deserts of Africa to forests of Britain. In Asia, dynasties expanded across steppe and sea. Each expansion was both necessity and ambition, feeding people, securing borders, and proving royal might. Caravans and conquests. Exploration was not always ships and oceans. Long before sails crossed seas, caravans crossed deserts. Kings of the Middle East and Asia supported traders who carried silk, spices, and gold along vast routes. These journeys brought wealth and new ideas into royal courts. Yet exploration was rarely peaceful. Conquerors like Alexander the Great pushed beyond their homelands, blending cultures while reshaping the world map. For kings, discovery and conquest often walked hand in hand. The age of sail. Centuries later, European monarchs ushered in the age of exploration. Kings and queens of Spain, Portugal, England, and France funded voyages that circled the globe. Christopher Columbus sailed west, seeking India, and found the Americas. Vasco da Gama reached India by sea, opening new routes for trade. Each voyage carried the flag of a crown, turning oceans into highways of empire. Wealth and discovery. Exploration brought riches: gold, silver, spices, and silk. But it also brought knowledge. Maps grew, horizons widened, and kings gained not only wealth but prestige. To rule lands beyond the horizon was proof of greatness. Unmatched. The world itself became a canvas for royal ambition. Shadows of expansion. Yet exploration also carried shadows. Conquests brought suffering to conquered peoples. Empires rose upon the labor of those who were enslaved, displaced, or silenced. Kings claimed glory, but history remembers the cost as well as the triumph. Exploration gave kings power, but it also left scars across continents. Closing of Block 2. For thus, kingship expanded from villages and valleys to oceans and continents. The crown became a symbol not only of local rule but of global reach. Ambition pushed humanity outward, forever changing the world's shape. As we move into the final block, we will reflect on the enduring meaning of kingship, why crowns still capture imagination, and how the legacy of ancient rulers continues to echo in the modern age. Kings once ruled with iron swords and golden crowns. They commanded armies, built monuments, and stood as living symbols of their people. Many of their thrones have crumbled, their palaces turned to dust, and their empires faded into history. Yet, the idea of kingship endures, a shadow of the past still visible in the present. Why? Because kingship was never only about politics. It was about something deeper, the human need for symbols, stories, and leaders who embody hope, strength, and continuity. monarchies that remain even in the modern age. Some crowns still rest upon royal heads. In Europe, Asia, and Africa, kings and queens continue as symbols of tradition. Their power may be limited, but their presence reminds nations of history's continuity. Ceremonies, coronations, and royal weddings still draw millions of eyes. In a world of constant change, monarchy offers a sense of permanence. Kingship as memory, even where monarchies have ended. The memory of kings lives on. Statues, ruins, and legends keep their names alive. Tourists walk through castles, pyramids, and temples, marveling at what rulers built. Stories of Arthur, Solomon, Cleopatra, and countless others are retold in books, films, and songs. Kings may be gone, but their myths breathe fresh life in every generation. Crowns in new forms, the spirit of kingship survives even outside monarchy. Leaders still borrow its symbols. Grand ceremonies, majestic palaces, powerful titles. Modern rulers and governments echo the traditions of kings, reminding us that authority still craves spectacle. Even in democracy, we see shadows of monarchy in parades, anthems, and the language of state. The crown never disappears, it changes shape. The lessons of kingship from kings, we inherit lessons. Some remind us of wisdom, justice, and courage. Others warn us of tyranny, greed, and folly. They show us the heights humanity can reach and the depths it can fall into. Through them, we understand not only power, but human nature itself. The eternal fascination. Why do we still look back at kings? Because they lived as larger-than-life figures, mirrors of human ambition and imagination. They built worlds, fought wars, patronized beauty, and became myths. To study them is to study ourselves, our hopes, our fears, our hunger for greatness. Closing of Block 25. Thus, the story of kings does not end with fallen thrones. It continues in memory, legend, and imagination. The crown is no longer iron or gold. It is symbolic, eternal, and woven into the story of humanity itself. As long as people tell stories, kings will live. For every ruin whispers their names, every legend recalls their deeds, and every crown, whether worn or imagined, reminds us of the timeless dance between power and people.